Hello everybody, I'm Selective. This will be part 7, chapter 7 of Susurrus of the Subdued, SOS. The rodent hummed, looking down at the files in paw as he stood outside the apartment complex. His normally cheerful expression was replaced by one of contemplation and seriousness. The area, or more specifically apartment 348, was completely blocked off, police located in each square inch to collect evidence. The previously once thin file on Deku had grown. They now had a face, name, age, everything, due to the email the child had sent Eraserhead. They had to watch out for the analyst already, so when Aizawa had gotten the email from them detailing the man's quirk, costume, and weaknesses, the Underground Pro had immediately contacted Nezu. The Mustelid had a team tracking the IP address within minutes, and after narrowing down the search, pinpointed it here. Despite the fact that they were quick in their approach to the apartment, when they arrived, neither of the Midoriyas were there, both seemingly non-existent. Nezu shut the file, handing it back to the detective.
If you don't mind, I'd like to take a look inside for myself.
Namasa nodded, putting the folder under his arm while he made his way towards the stairs. I already have a team working on gathering photos and backing evidence of the area, along with a few people collecting anything we might be able to send to forensics. He paused once they got to the top of the stairs, showing his ID to the officer that stood at the top. We're waiting to send out the missing person statement to the news until we know the whole situation. Once he was given a nod of confirmation, he continued. When we went to find the laptop he uses, it was nowhere to be seen, and we still don't know if he has any physical copies of his notes. But if he does, we can't find them. Nezu let out a noise of contemplation, tail swaying.
He might have taken them with him. Run off, perhaps?
That's what we thought at first, but there's no signs that he was planning to leave for a long period of time. His clothes, chargers, and personal items are all there. It's the same with his mother. The detective led the rodent into the apartment, maneuvering around the cops who swarmed the area. Plus, when we took a look into the kitchen, he added, rounding the corner into said room, there's signs that someone had been cooking, but for some reason stopped. Looking towards the stove, Nezu could see what the man was describing clearly. On the stove sat a small pan that, going off of what Naomasa had said, was most likely filled with some sort of food. Furthermore, the hook most likely made for hanging an apron was empty. We're going with the idea that one of them was cooking and a break-in occurred, but when we checked the doors and windows for signs of it, we found nothing. Tsukauchi continued. Nezu nodded.
If the person was let into the apartment willingly, then they wouldn't need to break in. There is also the possibility that the person who did this already had lawful access to the apartment.
Namasa blinked, adjusting the file in his arm. Are you implying that Deku was involved in a struggle with his mother? The Mustelid nodded, paws clasping together behind the small of his back.
Indeed. The boy is a villain, Tsukauchi-san. It's worth considering that he might have snapped in a way.
Namasa's mouth pressed into a thin line as he listened, finger tapping on the folder's cover.
However,
Nezu added on, facing his colleague once more,
the most logical conclusion is that someone has taken him to take advantage of his intelligence. Taking the mother could have just been for leverage. Not to mention, the memo that he snapped doesn't quite fit him after the email we got about Eraserhead.
Do you think he's innocent, then? Tsukauchi responded. The hybrid let out a soft chuckle, his thin tail giving a light flick behind him.
Have you ever heard of Schrodinger's cat theory?
He inquired instead of answering. Namasa quirked an eyebrow, silently requesting Nezu to elaborate.
The theory involves placing a cat, a radioactive atom, and a neurotoxin within a box and closing the lid. Now, because you cannot see inside the container, you don't know if the cat is dead or the radioactive material has decayed. Therefore, the cat is considered both alive and dead at the same time.
The detective blinked at the Mustelid, not sure where he was going with his statement. I don't see how this... Nezu held up a paw, silencing the man with a small smile.
In the case of the Midoriyas,
he continued.
Think of them as the cat. We don't know where they are, the scenario, or the events that occurred. They could either be alive or dead. Deku could either be the villain here or the victim, or they both could have been taken or left on their own accord. We won't know until we solve the case.
Namasa sighed, reaching his free hand up to pinch the bridge of his nose. So, in short, this whole damn thing's a mystery relying on theories. The mustelid clapped his paws together in front of him in a cheerful manner. Exactly. Tsukuuchi groaned, turning to leave the kitchen to head further into the house. I can already feel the headache this is gonna bring me. Izuku groaned awake, head pounding. Awareness to the boy felt hazy, like it was just close enough for him to see, but no matter how hard he strained himself, he just couldn't seem to reach it. The smell of bleach assaulted his nose, accompanied by the scent of warm machinery and iron. Shifting sluggishly, head feeling way heavier than he remembered, Izuku's eyes peeked open slightly, the lid still hooded. Wincing sharply from the light, the boy's viridian eyes closed again, hand attempting to reach towards his aching head. However, he barely lifted his arm a centimeter up before he felt something pull taut against the appendage, holding it down. Eyebrows furrowing, Midoriya's eyes squinted open once more, looking down towards his arm leisurely. It took only a moment for his eyes to focus, but when they did, the adrenaline rushing through his veins forced the fatigue out of his body. Around both of his wrists were dark brown leather straps that were bolted into a metal chair. On his right forearm was what looked to be orange paint that stained his skin. Focusing on the more important aspect of his arms, the boy looked to the straps. Leaning to one side, Izuku tugged against them, trying to dislodge his arm from the restraints. The only good yanking his arm against the leather served to do, however, was rub the skin under them raw. Abandoning the idea, the child looked up and to the right, taking in more of the bright room, despite the dulling pain still in his skull. In his line of sight were a few metal cabinets, a table containing lab equipment that was neatly organized, and a large trash bin. The decently sized room was blank, to say the least. The area was completely sterile, as if not a single piece of grime had entered the room. The boy would have analyzed the room further, if only to calm his panicking mind, but a sound coming from his left had made him jump. His head quickly whipped towards the noise, fearful eyes locking onto a man while he came from somewhere behind Izuku. The guy had on a black button-up that was loose at the collar, without a tie to pull it together. The shirt was buttoned all the way down despite the top, the end tucking into his dark-colored pants. His hands donned a pair of white gloves, the sleeves of his button-up not reaching them as they were rolled up past his elbows. Finally, a black fabric surgical mask covered the lower half of his face, leaving only his piercing yellow eyes and short brown hair visible. Deku watched the man, heart beating against his rib cage painfully. The person was walking towards the table on the right side of the room. It was similar to the other one, only this one had a few monitors resting on it. Furthermore, above the table were a few televisions that were hooked to the walls, screens off, and a wall with a large window. The window covered the majority of the upper wall, the room beyond it most likely built for observing. Watching the man pick up one of the sharper medical tools, the child's eyes widened, pupils dilating. Izuku began to panic, arms once again yanking back and rubbing his wrists raw. He tried to stand in his struggle, but found the effort futile as his ankles and wrists pulled the leather straps bounding them to the chair taut. His heart began to beat faster, breath quickening. The waterlines of his eyes filled before the tears slowly began to trail down his face. He didn't know this man, didn't fully know his intentions, but the fact that Izuku woke up chained down after he was essentially knocked out made his survival instincts flare up. He struggled against the leather binds, form trembling with effort as he tried to get free. Meanwhile, the unknown man stalked closer. When he got close enough, his gloved hand wrapped around Izuku's right arm, just under his elbow, and pushed it down against the armrest of the chair. The child's breath hitched as his throat croaked out his voice. "Wait, please!" The man's grip on his thrashing limb tightened, holding it down. "If you don't stay still, I'm going to need to try other means to get you to listen, child," he warned, voice annoyed. Deku didn't listen despite the threat, the mix of adrenaline and the hangover from Dataro's quirk messing up his sense of reason. "No!" the boy bit out. "I want to... Let me go! I want to go home!" The words tore out of his throat, raw and full of emotion. "I want my mom! I want..." The guy's grip tightened once again to the point Izuku could almost feel his fingernails through his gloves. "You won't have anything to go back to if you don't Midoriya's head turned to him so quickly that a wave of nausea coursed through him. "What did..." he hiccuped. "Where's my mom?" The man's forehead blistered, red hives forming along the corners. A moment later, he was stepping back, adjusting the scalpel in hand so he could take off one of his gloves. "I always have to get my hands dirty when dealing with you guys." He scowled, uncovered hand moving towards Izuku. The child could only thrash around in response, mouth still flowing out incoherent, terrified blabbles, never wanting to listen properly. The moment Izuku felt the guy's fingertips against his skin, all the boy knew was pain and darkness. The pain was sharp, red hot, and it made Izuku want to scream from the sheer sensation. However, it felt like he had his vocal cords stripped from him, the organ no longer able to conjure his voice. Before he knew it, though, Izuku was blinking wide, teary, and terrified eyes open to the laboratory again. His mouth was slightly agape, spit lingering on the corners. Every inch of the boy was trembling, and for a moment, nothing felt real. It was like he could feel every atom in his body in that split second of nothingness, yet everything at all. It was quick, sure, but in Izuku's mind it felt like a lifetime. His nerves burned with every minuscule movement that he made. Each rapid breath that entered and left his lungs caused a small, scorching feeling to run through his skin. It was as if all of his nerves were scraped raw and left in the cold air to experience every atom that rubbed against it. Flinching minutely as the man crouched down in front of Izuku to catch his ducked gaze, Viridian eyes quickly moved to look at the man's still exposed hand. "I don't like getting my hands dirty, Midoriya, so I expect you to cooperate from now on. Or that." His hand lifted, elbow resting on his knee, and Izuku recoiled. "Will happen again. Do you understand?" The thought of how exactly the man knew his name shot through the green boy's head, but not before the thought of blinding, hot pain. With a quick nod of his head, Deku pushed the thought down for later. "Good," the imposing person replied in satisfaction, slipping their glove back on and standing up. Readjusting the scalpel that had been sitting between his fingers, he moved back over to Izuku's right side. The child's eyes followed the masked person, his body flinching away from the sensation of his gloved hand pressing against his arm once more. However, this time, it felt like he could feel every individual fiber interacting with his neurons, and it was sending a febrile pain up his arm. Izuku's gaze moved down to watch the man's hand, and, more specifically, the small knife. His heart pumped faster, moving the blood through his body with a sensation similar to water. The river flowed from his chest, through his arms and legs, and up his spine. Most importantly, though, the rushing crimson river pushed up into his ears, ringing out like a drum. The beat to the instrumental-like pounding, reverberating off of the inside of his ears, making them hum. When the cold blade finally touched Izuku's arm, it made him shiver. His eyes quickly shut, head pressing back into the headrest. The tears that were left on his waterline were squeezed out, beginning to flow down his face once more. Deku began to quiver, brain already getting ready to endure the sensations that the scalpel will provide. Nothing could prepare the child for the stinging sensation that developed in his arm, though. It trailed down his forearm, starting just below his elbow and running down to just above his wrist. Izuku wanted to scream from the pure pain he felt, but for some reason he couldn't. Instead, he resorted to letting out choppy cries, the sobbing being the only form of agony that the child had energy for. "You're very important to a project I'm working on, Midoriya." The man spoke up, his voice steady. Izuku's head turned to the side, and away from him, trying to tune his voice out. However, listening to it was far easier than listening to the sounds of blade cutting through flesh. "The quirked are diseased. They need a cure." He paused, most likely focusing on the task of doing whatever he wanted to Izuku's limb. "The quirkless, however, are a gift, 1 in a million. That's why it's important you help me." The pain radiating from his arm was excruciating enough that the boy was beginning to feel lightheaded. However, he didn't want to pass out, not in front of this man at least. So he resorted to making his breaths more manual and controlled, body coating in a thin layer of sweat from the forced control. The now warm metal of the blade sunk deeper into his arm, tearing through every tissue with sickening, wet slices. He groaned, shifting as much as he could within his restraints in an attempt to get comfortable. However, while shying away from the pain, the blade went sideways. Izuku's mouth gaped open as he stilled, the sound he wanted to make not being expelled and being replaced by a high-pitched squeak. Saliva pooled in his cheeks, resting on the corners of his mouth. The guy grumbled something Deku couldn't understand, before the sound of him tossing the blade down on a nearby surface rang out. Something cold was then placed within Izuku's arm, and clamped down. It was painful, sure, but the fog seeping into his mind was slowly shutting the feeling off. He could vaguely still feel something within his arm being cut and removed sometime after the clamp was applied. The sensation was cold, his arm filling with a static buzz that faded out towards his shoulder. The guy had set something down, the sound of metal hitting metal wetly ringing out through Izuku's ears. Deku breathed out through his mouth with great effort, his nose now too clogged from crying to actually be of use. He wanted to ask the man questions, and more importantly, get answers, but right now Izuku's whole body was experiencing too much for him to fully comprehend how to talk. All the boy could seemingly do was choke out involuntary pained sobs. However, he did find it easier to focus on his breathing and the quick pace of his heart. Also, keep in mind what I said earlier. If you don't stay cooperative, I won't hesitate to dirty my hands with another Midoriya's blood. The masked man continued, applying what Izuku thinks is both stitches and bandages. Although, he couldn't really tell. His head was becoming foggy from either his hyperventilating or the vivisection he had just endured. Deku allowed himself to stew on the man's words, trying to figure out what they meant. Despite the forced focus, though, he couldn't. Everything was just too much. One thought was clear in his head, though. Izuku didn't know if he wanted to help people, if this is what it led to. Alright, everybody, that concludes Part 7, Chapter 7 of Susurrus of the Subdued, SOS. I think this, by far, was the worst and hardest chapter I've had to record out of all of them. I shook myself. My timbers are shaking, okay? I had to pause so many times when recording this. And Bomb kept getting little updates and snippets of just clips where I had to keep pausing because I couldn't get through it in one go. Nonetheless, please make sure to check out the Discord if you haven't already. If you would like to get updates easier, get connected with people within the fanfiction community, make requests for a podfic, and more. The link to the server will be in the description. Now, I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for listening.